Okay, picture this. The most powerful man in Europe, a king with huge armies and endless land, is forced to stand barefoot in a blizzard, literally begging for forgiveness. This isn't some made-up story. It actually happened. It was an incredible showdown between a king and a pope in the Middle Ages. So that's the big question, right? What could possibly happen that would make a mighty emperor travel across the Alps in winter just to shiver in the snow outside a castle? The answer to that question is all about a massive struggle for power that pretty much changed the world.
So here's how we're going to break down this story. First, we'll look at the clash of powers. Then, how words became weapons. We'll follow the incredible journey to Canossa, check out the uneasy truce that came after, and finally, we'll see why this whole event from centuries ago still matters today.
All right, let's set the stage. In medieval Europe, you had two major power players, the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. Think of them as the two heavyweights in the ring. They were both the ultimate authorities, but they were constantly at odds over who was really the boss. So let's break down their power. You've got the emperor, who controlled the physical world, all the land, the soldiers, the laws. His power was very real and very visible. But then you have the pope. He controlled the spiritual world, people's souls, their salvation, and their path to heaven. It kind of makes you wonder who's really more powerful, the guy who controls your life on earth or the guy who controls your eternal soul. The whole conflict really came down to this one kind of complicated sounding thing called lay investiture. Basically, for years and years, kings had been appointing their own bishops. And, it makes sense, right? If you're a king, you want your buddies in powerful positions, and bishops controlled a ton of land and money. But the church started saying, hang on a minute, how can a regular guy, a layman, choose a religious leader? They saw it as a major problem. And this is where our main characters enter the scene. You've got King Henry IV, a young, headstrong ruler who was not about to give up his power. And on the other side, Pope Gregory VII, a super serious reformer who was determined to make the church independent. You've got two incredibly powerful men who absolutely refuse to back down. You just know this is going to lead to a huge clash. So what started as a disagreement over appointments just completely blew up. This wasn't some quiet debate. It turned into an all-out public war, but a war fought with words, not swords. So in 1076, Henry makes a really bold move. He gets his bishops together and sends a letter to the Pope, calling him a false monk and basically telling him, you're fired. Well, Pope Gregory's response was, whoa. It was fast and it was absolutely devastating. He fired the king right back, not just from his job, but from the entire Christian faith. The Pope dropped his ultimate weapon, excommunication. Now, this was so much more than just getting kicked out of church. First, the spiritual part. Everyone believed an excommunicated person was totally doomed, no chance of getting into heaven. But what was maybe even scarier for Henry was the political effect. It meant that all of his subjects, his nobles, his knights, everybody, were suddenly free from their oaths of loyalty to him. And the result was instant. In the blink of an eye, Henry went from being this all-powerful king to a total outcast. His authority just evaporated. His own nobles saw their chance and gave him a deadline. Get the Pope's forgiveness in 1 year, or we're picking a new king. So Henry's back was completely against the wall. His kingdom was about to fall into civil war. He had one last desperate option. And that brings us to the most famous part of this whole story, his journey to the castle of Canossa. With that 1-year clock ticking down, Henry, his wife, and their toddler son set off to cross the Alps in the middle of winter. This was an insanely dangerous trip over frozen mountain passes in what was one of the coldest winters people could remember. He had to get to the Pope in Italy before the Pope could come to Germany and side with his enemies. Everything was on the line. He finally tracks the Pope down to this fortress-like castle called Canossa. But when he gets there, the gates stay shut. And so for 3 full days, the Holy Roman Emperor stood outside in a blizzard, waiting and begging. Just let that sink in for a moment. 3 days. And this wasn't just hanging around. It was a very public performance of penance, of being sorry. He took off all his fancy royal clothes and put on this simple, scratchy wool tunic that a sinner would wear. He stood there, barefoot, in the snow. He didn't eat. He just prayed and prayed, making sure everyone, especially the Pope watching from inside, could see how regretful he was. So, did it work? Was that the end of it?
Henry says he's sorry and everyone lives happily ever after? Not even close. What happened next was a really shaky truce, because saying sorry didn't actually fix the root of the problem.
On day 4, Pope Gregory finally let him in. See, the Pope was kind of trapped. As a priest, church rules said he had to forgive a sinner who showed that much remorse. So he did. He lifted the excommunication. Henry got his soul back, but the political fight for power, oh, that was far from over.
The second Henry got back to Germany, the fighting just exploded. A horrible civil war broke out. Years later, Henry actually got powerful enough to march his own army to Rome and force Pope Gregory into exile. The main issue, that whole lay investiture thing, wasn't actually settled until 1122, long after both Henry and Gregory were dead.
Okay, so if the war just kept going, why do we remember this one specific moment in the snow so clearly? Well, it's because Canossa wasn't just a temporary win for the Pope. It was a massive turning point, and its legacy actually affects us even today.
This event was so dramatic, so iconic, that the name of the castle itself became a famous phrase, going to Canossa.
And we still use that phrase when a politician or some public figure gets into a huge fight and is finally forced to make a really humiliating public apology. You'll hear people say they are going to Canossa. It's become shorthand for having to eat humble pie and surrender.
But its real impact is even bigger than a catchphrase. Canossa was one of the first times in history that a spiritual power clearly defeated a political one. It was a huge moment for establishing that the church and the government were separate things with separate powers. It really helped draw the lines between them, which was a major step toward the whole idea of separation of church and state that's so important in many countries today.
And all of this leaves us with one last big idea to think about. The story of the King in the Snow is this amazing historical drama, for sure. But it's also about a deeper question. When the power of a leader, with all their armies and laws, goes up against the power of a moral or spiritual idea, which one is ultimately stronger in the long run?